Hey everyone, Carlo here from AYCB, and today I'm going to be reviewing Cloudspire. Now this is obviously a massive game. It's a huge investment of both your time and money. There's a lot to explore here. It has a steep learning curve, but there's tons of game modes, tons of content in the box. So is it worth it? It's not just a simple yes or no question. It really depends on the type of gamer you are and what you're looking for. So first off, a couple things I'd like to get out of the way right away is this copy of Cloudspire was provided generously by Chip Theory Games as a review copy. The other thing is, this is the first game I've actually played from Chip Theory Games before, and it's also the first tabletop MOBA that I've played. So speaking of which, this is kind of influenced by a few different genres of video games, namely MOBAs, which stands for Multiplayer Online Battle Arena. So this is games like League of Legends, Dota 2, Heroes of the Storm. It's also influenced by tower defense games, and personally I think there's a lot of it that kind of reminds me of certain real-time strategy games, namely like Warcraft 3, and I'll get back to those comparisons a little later. But if you're familiar with Chip Theory Games, you'll know right away that they have probably the highest quality of components of any publishing company out there. I mean, just one look at what's inside the box here and you'll be absolutely astonished. I mean, the quality of the, these neoprene aisles, the earthscapes, these super high quality kind of poker chips. A lot of them are double-sided with different artwork on them and stuff. The quality of even the cards, like the events and the relics, like everything in here is truly just top class in terms of the quality of the components. You can't go wrong. If you're comfortable with the investment of money in here, you're going to be super happy with the quality of everything in the box. So now let's move on to some of the things I really like about the game. The factions, first off. Really interesting, really unique. There's 4 factions in the game. They all feel really different from each other in the way that they play. And even each faction has so many different ways that you can play them. One game with one faction, you might only use, like, let's say a quarter or a third of the units. You might not even see nearly what there is to offer for that faction. Another game, you might use some of those same units and not use other ones. There is a whole lot of really picking and choosing what direction you want to go in terms of your strategy. So yeah, there's a lot of variety and a lot of replay value just in terms of even playing the same faction over and over and over. I'm going to get back to the comparison I made to Warcraft 3 for a moment, just in terms of your army composition. So if anyone here has played those Warcraft games, you have kind of your 3 heroes, and then you've got a bunch of minions, and your heroes can go around exploring the map. And even the way the CP works in here with your command points, where every wave you're sort of picking what units you can sort of spend your command points on. You're limited, and you can get maybe 3 or 4 of these guys out, or you can go one of these big units that's more expensive with another one. It's kind of like the supply or food costs in Warcraft. So there's that idea of your army composition and how big of a role your heroes want to play. And to me, that was one of my favorite parts of Cloudspire, is that prep phase where you're looking at your CP that you have for that round and trying to determine which units you're going to pick, how you're going to deploy them. If you've played MOBAs, you know that normally they're team-based games. In Cloudspire, there is a team, like an optional team mode. If you're playing with 4 players, you can play 2 versus 2. But otherwise, it's kind of just one-on-one, or you can play a 3-player, everyone for themselves. There's also solo mode and co-op, which I'll talk about a bit later. So there's a lot of things that it recreates from MOBAs in the sense of having these lanes that your minions are kind of marching down towards your opponent's base that you're trying to defeat. So that's definitely similar. I feel like there's a little more control and manipulation of the minions in this game. In terms of, like, in a lot of the MOBAs I've played, it's kind of just they automatically march and you're there with your hero trying to follow, and most of what you do is with your actual heroes. Whereas in this, there's a lot of kind of stuff you can do with your minions. There's so much to consider in this game. I have to say, for me, the first few times I played it, it was pretty overwhelming. Lots of reading up all the talents and keywords on the faction sheets, looking back on the rules for clarifications. Sometimes we would play, half of a game and then realize, oh, we played with this one rule wrong, and it's kind of, this isn't the type of game where you can really go back. Like, if it's just the very next turn, sometimes you say, oh, I forgot to do this thing here. I forgot that my fortress advancement gives me a discount. Is it okay if I just, you can sometimes do that, but for the most part, there's a lot of things where you just have to decide as a group, like, okay, it's too late. We have to just play on. We have to just accept we got that rule wrong. So that's one of the things that sometimes got in the way for me fully enjoying Cloudspire, is just the rules overhead, having to check things to make sure they're being done right. Even something as simple as you move here and, okay, I'm within range of this many spires if I get here, but then which order do they fire in based on which player is going. So yeah, there's so much to think about in Cloudspire, and it's one of those games, it's really demanding of your time and patience, and as well as the people you're playing with. For the most part, in terms of the actual iconography on the chips and on everything, it's not too much trouble to keep up with. It's fairly straightforward. The only thing that can be kind of tricky is how on the heroes and units, the colors for, attack and movement and stuff are all the same, but on Spires they're different. So on Spires, green means range, whereas on the units it's their movement. And even on the heroes and minions, the red thing is their health, whereas on a Spire, the red is their attack. So there's a bit of that to kind of get used to, especially when it's your first time playing. The other aspect is, so with the Spires, you have the upgrades that go underneath them, and I think it works super well. It's one of my favorite aspects of the whole, just of all the components and how the components actually work for you to help you out while you're playing. So, for example, you can be looking across the map, and you don't have to look over and see what kind of Spire it is or what its base stats are. You can just kind of look down and see, okay, this one has like a fortification and 2 range upgrades, or this one has these upgrades. That works super well in terms of not having to kind of like lean over and see what everyone else has going on. For the heroes and minions, it's a little different because other than the health chips that are stacked underneath them, you don't know what their base stats are. So especially when there's multiple players, you might be able to see from afar, like, okay, that guy's got 3 health on him, but what's the base stats? Okay, they have this much attack, and what's the movement on that one, and how far? Okay, and what's the keyword talent on that one? So sometimes there's like, you have to be leaning over and kind of trying to read this and read that and account for everything that's going on. But for the most part, the components do really help you out in terms of making everything visually kind of easy to grasp. Another thing I really like is the terrain types. So most units can just move on path hexes, but there's all these different terrain types. There's a nifty little chart that's on the back of the reference sheet that kind of shows how different units can move across those. And it's one of the things that really sets the heroes apart, as well as certain other units that have those terrain allowances. Because sometimes your heroes can feel maybe a little weaker or a little more underpowered than you'd maybe initially think. You look at one and think, oh, this guy only has like 2 health and 1 attack. So you're worried to get out. You don't want to basically attack a bunch and then get retaliated against or be caught out somewhere. But then you start realizing you have that freedom of movement to go exploring landmarks. You can go back to your base to heal. You can level up and flip onto the promoted side. Another thing I'd like to point out, I don't really know if it's fair to say this is a criticism or not, because it's part of what makes you really look forward to using those big, powerful units. But when you play as these factions, a lot of the time, because the more powerful, high-cost units, you have limited CP for them, a lot of the time you can only get 1 of them out and play at a time, or maybe 2, or you only get them out in the 3rd or 4th wave late in the game. So a lot of the game is spent with these kind of smaller, maybe less interesting units, and there's more of them, but they're cheap in terms of CP. So you use a bunch of these kind of less interesting units early on, and then when you finally get that one really cool unit and you start blasting away from range, or you have this cool ability that's hitting multiple units or swapping places with something, but then that takes 2 or 3 hits and it might be gone, and you think, oh, I only got to use that a few turns. So it feels like a lot of the most fun units have very limited use, and you spend a lot of your time kind of manipulating the ones that aren't quite as fun. I do have to say, the one, in my opinion, big oversight with this was this game could have really used player aids. Like, I'm talking just, even if it was a double-sided sheet, or even I've seen games that have like a booklet, maybe 4 or 5 pages, maybe it would have, some of the keywords listed, or a little recap of each faction, just so that like, let's say I'm playing as the Brahmin. It'd be nice to have a sheet that has the other 3 factions and tells me kind of what they can do. Like, the heirs are mostly flying units, and they have these units that can kind of kamikaze and explode and do a bunch of damage, and, or knowing that the Grove Tenders can summon units, but they don't give you as much source when you take them out. Things like that, so that I don't always have to be asking my opponent, like, oh, what does that unit do? Or can you pass me your faction sheet? There's only 1 of each sheet, so if I'm wondering what one of my opponent's units does, or what the strengths or weaknesses of their faction are, or what one of their fortress advancements does, I have to ask them to read something off a sheet, which at times is like a few sentences long. So player aids would have been so useful. Now I want to get back to talking about just how many things there are going on in the game. Okay, so what I like is when you have a game that has so many options, and there's so many things you can consider and combine, okay, I'm going to do this and this and this and this and that. Personally, I don't want there to be tons of randomness and luck involved. I like games that have a lot of luck and randomness if they're short, quicker games. When a game is this long and this complex, sometimes it doesn't feel great to come up with this big master plan and then feel like it got ruined by one sort of random factor. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these. The first is the events, which I have to say the events are probably my least favorite aspect of Cloudspire. I really didn't enjoy the inclusion of them. I think it's something that maybe if you've played the game, let's say 50 times, 100 times or whatever, and you've kind of you've gotten used to all the factions and what everything does, maybe things start to feel a little predictable, and maybe the events add some excitement and randomness. But for me, it felt like it was too swingy. Sometimes it really helped one player and didn't help another. Let me give you an example. So one of the ones, like, let's say you're battling over this big source wall in the middle of the area, in the middle of the map. We had a game where 3 of us were fighting over this thing, and then one person finally kind of won the battle, built their spire in the middle, and established that dominance. Then the next turn we flip over an event card and it says, remove the source, or remove a spire from the center source wall on the map. And it just felt like, okay, so we battled over this whole thing, and the person who won it is now just like, is just unlucky that this event card came up and removed the spire that they worked to, they even spent the resources building it, let alone all the units fighting over it. The relic cards I liked a lot more than the events. Personally, they still have a bit of that randomness. Sometimes you get them and realize, okay, I can't even make use of this, and I just sat here, attacking this landmark minion, taking retaliate damage, hoping to get a good relic, and now this one isn't really going to help me. So they're a little more interesting and a little less kind of swingy than the events, in my opinion, and for the most part, they are rewarding and they're fun to use a lot of the time. One more thing with the randomness is obviously the dice. So I have to say, the dice didn't really upset me as much as I thought they would. Again, I'm not usually a fan of a lot of randomness in these bigger, longer games. There was one game, I think it was the very first time or maybe second time that Dylan and I actually played a 2-player game, and there was a point where the game came down to essentially a dice roll on a spire. There was a unit that was about to destroy a fortress, and that unit had 1 health left, and the spire just needed to roll a 1 or a 2, which is basically a 5 and 6 shot, and it rolled the blank, and so that unit killed the fortress, and otherwise the game might have gone the other way. And even though it felt a little bit unsatisfying to lose that way, I also knew I could have done something different to plan around that. So again, that part of that is going to just come down to your preference in terms of, are you okay with playing a really long game and then losing on something that feels somewhat unlucky maybe? Do you want more control over what's going on? So going back to some of the rules clarifications and the keywords, there's one type of unit called the Elfin Kaze, which is for the heirs, and this is probably the most complicated unit in the game. There's only a little kind of paragraph on the sheet for the heir faction, and again, this isn't something that the other players have access to unless they ask for it. So there were these units that we thought we understood exactly how they worked. They have a few different talents on them. Each one has like a pretty decent sized paragraph explaining what that talent does. And it was only after the first maybe couple times I played that I started wondering, maybe I don't know exactly how these work. Surely enough, I went online, I found a big rules clarification thread about exactly how the Elfin Kaze work, and it turns out we were playing with them slightly wrong. So it's just another example of, if you're going to try the game out, I wouldn't recommend starting out with that faction, just because, again, there's a bit of a learning curve with those Elfin Kaze. I don't want to make it seem like all of the looking down at keywords and looking down at the sheets is cumbersome, because it's not. In fact, one of my favorite aspects of the game is actually the build phase and the prep phase, which both come right before the onslaught phase where you do all your fighting. And those ones, you spend most of that time looking down at your fortress, looking down at these sheets, looking at your units, trying to decide what you're going to do. But I found that super interesting. It was really fun, actually, to decide, because that's where you're basically forming your whole strategy. Like, what advancements do I want to invest in that are then going to affect what spires I can build, or whether certain units are going to be released or deployed on their promoted side. And that kind of puzzle of choosing what to invest in early, what direction to go in, because you're going to, there's room for pivoting somewhat throughout, but if you start investing in a fortress advancement and you go up to number 3 on one of these early on and then you don't use it for the other waves, then you kind of wasted that source. So even when you're not in the onslaught phase, that planning is really fun, really satisfying, and especially when you see it come to life before you, it's really rewarding on a level that a lot of games don't ever reach, I have to be honest. To give you an idea, when I eat, I'm the type of person who gets all the work done first, and then I want to just enjoy my meal. So even if it's a steak, and I know this sounds like sacrilege to a lot of you probably, but I'll cut this steak up in all the pieces first, put the knife down so that I can just sit and focus on eating. Most people don't do that. Most people cut a piece and eat and whatever. And that kind of is what Cloudspire feels like, is I would rather do all the work, understand the rules, and once I get going, I don't really want to stop and have too many things to trip me up as I go. Whereas other people might be fine with that. They want to kind of just get going, and they'll deal with those things as they come up. So really, I want to stress how much that is a matter of personality, and I know a lot of people don't really mind having a bit of that spread out in favor of getting started quicker on the front end. So as I mentioned, there's tons of different modes of play. I have to say I was really impressed with the solo mode. After playing this game head-to-head a couple times, a few times 2 players and 3 players, I thought maybe I should dive into the solo mode. It felt like it was a little daunting at first because there's a section of reading up how the AI works, and you have to read about how the kind of progression of scenarios works, but it feels like one of those, again, going back to Warcraft 3, it feels like the single-player campaign where you get 4 missions for each of the 4 factions. So you're playing against different factions. First off, it's an excellent way to learn the game. That was where I found it was easiest because I didn't feel like I was holding up other players. I was in a room by myself, reading through this book. If I want to sit there and take 5 or 10 minutes to plan a turnout and come up with the perfect strategy, I'm holding myself up, and that's fine, and I was okay with that. That was where I enjoyed Cloudspire most, was as a solo game, especially because, again, there's a bit of that learning curve, so it felt easier for me to experiment and plan stuff out. There's also a really rewarding kind of objective system in there where each scenario has 3 objectives, and you have to complete at least 1, but the more you complete, you get these rewards that you can spend on little bonuses that you can use on future scenarios. So that single-player campaign mode, honestly, I have to say this is one of the best, if not the best, solo games, tabletop games I've played. There's tons of replay value. You can just leave it set up on the table and come back to it. I had mine set up for a few weeks at a time. I'd come back, play a few waves of a scenario, or play one here and there. Solo mode is really, really, really good, and if you're open to solo gaming at all, this might be the best game for you to try in terms of that. So, is Cloudspire for you? Well, if you're looking to just have another game on the shelf, you have tons of games, and you're thinking, oh, it'd just be nice to have another option when people come over, I don't think that's really what Cloudspire is for. You're not going to bring Cloudspire to a random game night and just say like, hey, you guys want to try this game Cloudspire? You never heard of it? You're probably not going to bring it out and just suggest teaching it to a bunch of people for the first time. But if you're looking for a game, you have a dedicated group of people, or you have a small collection, you're looking for a game that you really want to dive into over the next year or 2 or however long, this is such a richly rewarding game that has so many things to discover. I found the more I was able to invest, the more I was rewarded for it, and that truly did feel good. But a lot of that just depends on sort of, how much you're willing to stick it out and learn the systems, because like any heavy game out there, it can seem really overwhelming at first, and we've all played those games that, once you just played them enough, you get to know them like the back of your hand, and then you think back, wow, that was so daunting before, now it's relatively easy. I just personally haven't had quite the time to get to that point with Cloudspire. I'm the type of gamer who likes to play a lot of different games. I spent a lot of time just playing Cloudspire for weeks on end. I enjoyed my time with it, but now I feel like I have to move on to some other games, and I wonder if by the time I come back to this, I hope it hasn't been too long and I've forgotten a bunch of the rules. I hope to not have that same feeling of that kind of daunting feeling of having to learn everything over again, and I hope that I can come back to it and get back to the solo mode and finish off that campaign. I'd like to get back to the co-op mode, but again, if you're the type of person who's looking for a game to dive into and you have a dedicated group of friends and you're going to have maybe like a weekly or monthly Cloudspire night, this might be just the perfect game for your gaming group. So whether it's for you or not, there's a lot to appreciate just in terms of how the game is designed, how it's presented. At its best, I found Cloudspire to be a really tense, intricate, rewarding game that really has a lot of options, and you're never going to play the same game twice. At its worst, sometimes I got a little frustrated or felt like there was too much downtime reading things, but again, that's with the fact that it at least rewards you for doing that is good. It would have been different if I had felt like, oh, I'm reading all this stuff and it's not having any payoff. That wasn't the case. It's a lot of work and it's demanding of you, but if you're willing to put in that demand, this game has so much to offer, and I can't stress enough how much value there is in this box if you're willing to dive in and take the plunge and you have the players to play it with you. So that's about all I've got for Cloudspire. I'm kind of curious, maybe you guys think I'm overreacting a little bit. Have you guys found it easier than me to get into? Is there something I've missed maybe? Do you guys find that there's a particular mode that's better or worse? I'm curious to hear, so let me know in the comments below. If you like what we're doing in these types of videos, it would help us out a lot if you either liked or subscribed. You can also check out all of our content at allyoucanboard.com. And yeah, that's Cloudspire. Keep in mind there's also been expansions out already with new factions, new modes to play and stuff like that. So if you're interested, take a look online. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.